Wind tore across the snow-covered ridge, carrying the clatter of metal and the cold bite of gunpowder. Through binoculars, a cluster of enemy soldiers stood on the high ground, laughing as if the battlefield were a casino floor. "Bet us," their voices echoed through the white forest, dripping with contempt. At the edge of the trench, the sniper tightened her grip on the rifle stock, her blue eyes calm to the point of unsettling. No one in the squad thought she'd fire. They thought she'd hesitate. But as the laughter hit the bottom of the silence, she exhaled one thin breath. And then, everything began. The terrain was unforgiving. Ridge 347 rose at a 40-degree angle, pine trees scattered thin across its face, their bare branches skeletal against the gray sky. Snow layered everything, rocks, roots, frozen mud, turning the slope into a treacherous ladder. At the summit, maybe 600 meters upslope from where First Squad huddled behind a collapsed stone wall, the enemy had dug in. They weren't just dug in, they were comfortable. Lieutenant Marcus Hayes pressed the binoculars tighter against his brow, his jaw working silently. Through the lenses he counted 9 hostiles. They'd set up a heavy machine gun emplacement behind sandbags, angled to sweep the open meadow his squad needed to cross. 2 more positions flanked it. A mortar team on the left, a designated marksman's nest on the right. The kind of overlapping fields of fire you'd see in a textbook. But what made Hayes's blood simmer wasn't the tactics, it was the attitude. One of the enemy soldiers, tall, broad-shouldered, probably their squad leader, stood fully upright behind the sandbags, arms spread wide like a ringmaster. He shouted something down the slope. The words were garbled by wind, but the tone was unmistakable. Mockery. His men laughed. One of them raised a bottle, took a swig, and tossed it into the snow. Hayes lowered the binoculars. "They think this is a game." Beside him, Corporal Danny Riggs spat into the snow. "Can't blame 'em, LT. We're pinned. They know it." He wasn't wrong. First Squad had been trying to withdraw for the past 2 hours, falling back from a botched reconnaissance push that had turned hot fast. The plan had been simple. Move through the valley, link up with 2nd Platoon 5 clicks west, regroup. But the enemy had anticipated the route, cut them off at the ridge, and now 9 rifles stood between Hayes's 7 soldiers and survival. The meadow stretched 300 meters wide, a killing field. No cover except knee-high brush that wouldn't stop a pellet gun, let alone rifle fire. If they tried to cross, the machine gun would shred them in seconds. If they stayed, the enemy mortar team would dial in their position and obliterate the stone wall sheltering them. Hayes checked his watch. 1,400 hours. In 30 minutes, the sun would dip low enough that the glare off the snow would blind anyone moving west. That gave the enemy perfect shooting conditions. "Bet us!" The shout came again, clearer this time, riding the wind like a taunt. "Bet us you can't make it." Riggs clenched his fists. "Permission to return fire, sir." "Denied." Hayes's voice was flat. "We burn ammo on suppression, we'll be dry before nightfall, and we are not spending a night out here." Private First Class Aaron Kelly, crouched low against the wall, glanced at the lieutenant. "So what's the play?" Hayes didn't answer it immediately. He scanned his squad. Kelly, young but steady. Riggs, experienced but hot-headed. Specialist Bryce Mallory, their radio man, trying and failing to raise 2nd Platoon on a snow-choked frequency. Private Evan Cross, shivering despite his layered gear. Private Nora Jennings, checking her rifle's action for the 4th time in 10 minutes. And Sergeant Claire Emerson. She sat apart from the group, back against the stone wall, rifle resting across her lap. Her gloves were off despite the cold. Fingers flexed slowly, deliberately, like a pianist warming up. She wasn't looking at the ridge. She was looking at nothing. Her gaze unfocused, her breathing measured. Hayes had seen that look before. It was the look of someone running calculations. "Emerson," he said quietly. Her eyes shifted to him. No words, just waiting. "You see what I see up there?" She nodded once. 9 hostiles, overlapping fire, heavy MG, probable PKM variant, mortar team, 2-man, marksman, elevated right flank. Her voice was flat, clinical. Winds gusting northwest, 8 to 12 miles per hour. Temperature dropping, visibility decent but degrading. "Can you make the shot?" The question hung in the air. Around them, the squad went still. Claire Emerson didn't answer right away. She looked up at the ridge, where the enemy soldiers still laughed, where the bottle thrower raised his arms in a mocking cheer. "Bet us," the wind carried again. Her mouth twitched, not quite a smile, something colder. "Which shot, sir?" she asked. Hayes met her eyes. "The one that gets us out of here alive." Claire Emerson had been with First Squad for 6 weeks. In infantry terms, that made her practically invisible. Not new enough to be coddled, not veteran enough to be trusted. She'd passed her marksmanship qualifications at Fort Benning with top scores, earned her spot as the squad's designated marksman, and promptly faded into the background. She didn't drink with the others, didn't swap stories, didn't push back when Riggs made jokes about her size, 5'6", 130 pounds soaking wet, or when Kelly asked a little too earnestly if she needed help carrying her gear. She just existed, quietly, efficiently. Hayes respected that. He didn't need loudmouths, he needed professionals. But respect wasn't the same as confidence, and right now with 9 hostiles holding the high ground and his squad's survival hanging by a thread, Hayes needed to be confident in the person he was about to hand the mission to. "Emerson's solid," Riggs had said once, weeks ago, after a training exercise where she'd put 15 rounds through 15 silhouettes at 400 meters. For a boot. The caveat that always followed, as if her skill came with an expiration date. Now, crouched behind the stone wall with the enemy's laughter rolling down the slope, Hayes watched her. She'd pulled her gloves back on, was checking the scope on her M110 rifle with calm, methodical precision. No wasted movement, no hesitation. "Sir," Riggs muttered, leaning close, "you really think she can pull this off?" Hayes didn't look at him. "You have a better idea?" "I could lay suppression. Kelly and Cross flank left, Mallory and Jennings go right, you and Emerson push center. And we'd lose 3 people before we made it halfway." Hayes's tone was sharp enough to cut. "The MG would chew us apart, you know that." Riggs's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. Private Evan Cross, hunched nearby, wasn't as restrained. "LT, no offense, but she's never been in a real firefight. Training's one thing. This?" He gestured at the ridge. "This is different." "I know it's different," Hayes said evenly. "So why her?" "Because," Hayes said, turning to meet Cross's eyes, "she's the only one in this squad who can make a 600-meter shot in crosswind with degrading light and no spotter backup. You want to try it?" Cross shut his mouth. Claire didn't react. She'd heard every word. Hayes knew she had, but her expression didn't shift. She just kept working, adjusting the elevation dial on her scope, checking the bolt, running her fingers along the barrel to feel for ice buildup. Nora Jennings, the squad's SAW gunner, glanced over. "You good, Emerson?" Claire looked up. Her blue eyes were steady, unreadable. "I'm good." "You sure? Because if you're not—" "I'm good," Claire repeated, firmer this time. Jennings held her gaze for a moment, then nodded. "All right." It wasn't trust. Not yet. But it was something. Hayes crouched beside Claire, lowering his voice. "I need you to be honest with me. Can you do this?" She met his eyes. No bravado, no false confidence, just calm assessment. "Depends on what this is, sir. I need a precision shot. Someone up there is calling the plays, probably their squad leader. Big guy, standing tall behind the sandbags. You drop him, the rest will panic, lose cohesion. That gives us a window to move." Claire nodded slowly. "One shot?" "One shot to start. After that—" Hayes exhaled. "After that, we'll see." She was quiet for a moment, her gaze drifting back to the ridge. The enemy soldiers were still celebrating, still shouting their taunts into the wind. One of them fired a burst from his rifle into the air, celebratory, reckless. "They think we're already dead," Claire said softly. "They're wrong." Hayes's voice was steel. Claire's fingers flexed on the rifle stock. "Wind's inconsistent, gusting. I'll need to time the shot between gusts, or the round will drift." "Can you do it?" "Yes." No hesitation, no qualification, just yes. Hayes felt something loosen in his chest, not relief. There was no room for relief yet, but a faint, fragile thread of hope. "All right," he said, "get ready." Claire nodded. She shifted her position, angling her body toward a narrow gap in the stone wall that would give her a sight line to the ridge. She settled the rifle's bipod, adjusted her posture, exhaled slowly. Behind her, the squad watched. Riggs skeptical, Cross nervous, Jennings guarded, Kelly somewhere between hopeful and terrified. And up on the ridge, the enemy laughed. "Bet us!" the shout came again. Claire's lips moved, too quiet for anyone else to hear. "Bet me," she whispered. The radio crackled with static, then died. Bryce Mallory yanked the handset away from his ear, swearing under his breath. "Still nothing, LT. Second platoon's either out of range or they've got their own problems," Hayes finished. He checked his watch again, 14:13. 17 minutes until the sun angle turned the meadow into a shooting gallery bathed in golden light. 17 minutes until their window closed completely. From the ridge, a new sound, the hollow thunk of a mortar tube. "Incoming!" Riggs barked. The squad flattened. 3 seconds later, the round detonated 60 meters to their left, spraying snow and frozen dirt into the air. The explosion was sharp, percussive, more harassment than precision. A ranging shot. Hayes didn't need to be told what that meant. The enemy mortar team was dialing them in. The next round would be closer. The one after that, closer still. In 5 minutes, maybe less, this stone wall would become a tomb. We're out of time, Kelly said, his voice tight. We need to move, LT, now. Move where? Jennings shot back. Across the meadow? They'll cut us down before we make it 10 meters. So we just sit here and wait for the mortars to bracket us? We wait for Emerson to— She's one person, Cross interrupted, his voice cracking. One rifle. Even if she drops their leader, the rest of them will light us up the second we break cover. Hayes raised a hand. Quiet. The squad fell silent. Another mortar round shrieked overhead, impacting 40 meters left this time. Closer. The enemy was tightening the noose. Hayes turned to Claire. She hadn't flinched at the explosion, hadn't even looked up. Her focus was absolute, her body motionless except for the slow rise and fall of her breathing. Emerson, Hayes said, honest assessment, you dropped their squad leader, then what? She was quiet for a moment, still staring through her scope. Depends how they react. Best case? They panic, lose command structure, fire discipline breaks down, you get 30 seconds, maybe a minute, while they regroup. Worst case? Their second in command takes over immediately. They maintain cohesion, you get nothing. Hayes grimaced. 30 seconds wasn't much, but it was more than they had now. What if you don't stop at one? He asked. Claire finally looked at him. Sir? Their squad leader, their mortar team, their MG gunner, their marksman. Hayes's voice was low, deliberate. You take them all out fast enough, their whole position collapses. Riggs stared. LT, that's 5 targets, at 600 meters, in less than a minute. I know what it is. That's not a plan, that's a Hail Mary. You have a better option? Hayes snapped. Because I am open to suggestions, Corporal. Riggs opened his mouth, then closed it. He had nothing. Another mortar round. 30 meters left, the wall shuddered, dust and snow rained down. Hayes turned back to Claire. Can you do it? She didn't answer right away. Her eyes were distant, calculating. 5 targets, 600 meters, crosswind, degrading light, a squad full of people who doubted her, and an enemy that thought she was already beaten. Her fingers tightened on the rifle. I'll need 30 seconds after the first shot, she said quietly. No one moves, no one fires, just silence, so I can hear the wind. You'll have it, Hayes said. And if I miss, you won't. Her eyes snapped to his, searching for doubt, for hesitation. She found neither. 30 seconds, she repeated. 30 seconds, Hayes confirmed. He raised his voice, addressing the squad. Listen up. Emerson takes the shot. When she fires, nobody moves, nobody breathes. She's going to drop 5 hostiles in under a minute, and when she does, we are crossing that meadow at a dead sprint. Jennings, you're on point. Riggs, rear guard. Kelly, cross Mallory, stay tight on my 6. Understood? A chorus of uncertain acknowledgments. I said, understood? Yes, sir, sharper this time. Hayes looked at Claire one last time. Whenever you're ready, Sergeant. She nodded, turned back to her scope, settled her breathing. The wind gusted, then lulled. On the ridge, the enemy soldiers jeered. One of them raised his rifle, fired another celebratory burst into the air. Bet us, the shout echoed. Claire Emerson closed her eyes, inhaled, exhaled. And when she opened them again, the world narrowed to 5 points of light. There was a moment, years ago, before the uniform, before the rifle, before any of this, when Claire Emerson learned what it meant to be underestimated. She'd been 17, a high school shooting club in rural Wyoming. The coach, a grizzled ex-Marine named Hendricks, had looked at her the way most people did, polite skepticism wrapped in a thin layer of encouragement. Shooting's about discipline, he'd said, not strength. You'll do fine. You'll do fine. The participation trophy version of expectations. She'd placed second in the state championship that year, missed first by a single point, a shot rushed, a breath held too long, a mistake born from wanting to prove herself too badly. Hendricks had pulled her aside afterward. You know why you lost? She'd expected a lecture on technique. Instead, he'd said, because you were trying to show everyone you belonged. Stop trying. Just be. It had taken her 3 more years to understand what he meant. Being a sniper wasn't about proving anything. It wasn't about silencing the doubters or earning respect or making a statement. It was about the wind, the distance, the target. It was about reducing the world to variables and constants, to breath and heartbeat, to the single moment between intention and execution. Everything else, ego, fear, anger, was noise, and noise got you killed. Now, pressed against the frozen ground behind the stone wall, Claire let the noise fade. The squad's tension, the enemy's taunts, the mortar rounds inching closer, all of it dissolved into background static. She focused on the scope's reticle, on the rhythm of her breathing, on the faint tremor in her fingers as adrenaline tried to claw its way in. She pushed it down, steady, controlled. Through the scope, the enemy position sharpened. The squad leader first, tall, broad, standing upright like he owned the ridge. Tactical vest, no helmet, rifle slung casually over one shoulder, arrogant. He was shouting something to his men, gesturing toward the meadow, probably planning the next phase of their harassment. Claire's crosshair settled on his chest. Center mass. 620 meters, her range estimation told her. Wind gusting 8 miles per hour from the northwest, snow particles dancing in the air giving her a visual reference. She adjusted the scope, accounted for bullet drop, wind drift, the cold air's effect on muzzle velocity. Her training kicked in, automatic, ingrained. Benning had drilled it into her. Distance, wind, angle, target movement. 4 variables, 4 solutions. Her breathing slowed. Inhale for 4 counts, hold for 2, exhale for 6. The rifle steadied. But she didn't fire. Not yet, because the squad leader wasn't the only threat. Take him out, and the second in command would step up. The mortar team would keep firing. The machine gunner would keep the meadow locked down. 1 shot wouldn't save them. 5 shots would. Claire shifted her focus. Mortar team, left flank. 2 men, 1 feeding rounds, 1 adjusting the tube's angle. 60 meters from the squad leader's position. She'd need to traverse fast, acquire the new target, fire before they realized what was happening. Then the machine gunner. Center position, partially obscured by sandbags. Harder shot, less exposure. She'd have maybe a second when he shifted to reload or adjust his belt feed. Then the marksman, right flank. Elevated, prone, rifle already trained on the meadow. The most dangerous target. If she didn't take him out, he'd zero in on her muzzle flash and return fire. 5 targets, 30 seconds, maybe less. She ran the sequence in her mind. Fire, cycle the bolt, acquire, fire, cycle, acquire, fire. No hesitation, no second guessing. Each shot had to be clean, final. Hendrix's voice echoed in her memory. Stop trying, just be. Claire exhaled. Her heart rate dropped below 60 beats per minute. The world shrank to the scope, the crosshair, the wind. She wasn't trying to prove anything. She was just being what she'd trained to be. And what she'd trained to be was the difference between her squad walking out of this valley or being buried in it. Her finger rested on the trigger. Featherlight pressure, not enough to fire, just enough to feel the break point, the exact moment where intention would become action. On the ridge, the enemy squad leader threw his head back and laughed. Claire's crosshair didn't waver. Bet us, his voice carried down the slope. Her lips moved, soundless. I already did. The wind lulled. Claire felt it before she saw it. The sudden absence of pressure against her left cheek, the stillness that settled over the ridge like held breath. Through the scope, snow particles stopped dancing. The trees went motionless. 3 seconds, maybe 4. That's all she'd have before the next gust hit. She didn't think. Thinking was too slow. Her body moved on trained instinct. Crosshair on the squad leader's sternum. Finger pressure increased. The trigger broke clean. The M110 kicked against her shoulder, a familiar punch absorbed through muscle memory. The suppressor muted the report to a sharp crack, flatter than an unsuppressed rifle but still audible. Not that it mattered. In 3 seconds, silence wouldn't be a factor. Through the scope, she didn't wait to see the impact. She was already cycling the bolt, the spent casing ejecting in a smooth arc. Her right hand never left the grip. Her left hand guided the rifle's traverse, smooth and mechanical, 60 meters left. Mortar team. 2 targets, but only 1 mattered. The gunner adjusting the tube. He was turning, mouth open, probably shouting something. Claire's crosshair found his center mass just as he looked up. Fire, cycle. The second round punched downrange. She was already moving again, traversing right, back toward the center position. The machine gunner was sitting upright now, hands reaching for his weapon, realizing something had gone wrong but not yet understanding what. Claire's breathing stayed even. Inhale, exhale. Crosshair on his upper chest. Fire, cycle. 15 seconds elapsed. 2 left. The marksman on the right flank was moving now, fast, trained, already swinging his rifle toward the meadow, scanning for her muzzle flash. He was good. Probably the best shooter they had. Didn't matter. Claire's scope found him just as he found her. For a fraction of a second, their crosshairs met across 600 meters of frozen air, 2 professionals recognizing each other in the moment before one of them ceased to exist. Fire, cycle. 20 seconds. The remaining hostile, second in command standing near the sandbags, was shouting, his rifle unslung now, pointing wildly toward the meadow. He hadn't pinpointed her position yet. Too much chaos, too much shock. Claire's crosshair settled on him with the same cold precision as the others. Fire. 23 seconds. She didn't cycle the bolt this time. She held position, watching through the scope as the enemy position unraveled. The remaining 4 hostiles scattered. No cohesion, no leadership. One of them fired a wild burst from his AK toward the meadow, 30 degrees off from Claire's actual position. Another dropped behind the sandbags, hands over his head, A third actually ran, down the backside of the ridge, abandoning his post entirely. The machine gun sat silent, unmanned. The mortar tube pointed uselessly at the sky. The marksman's nest was empty. Hayes's voice cut through the ringing in Claire's ears. "Go, now, move, move, move!" The squad erupted from behind the stone wall. Jennings led the sprint, her SAW held at the ready. Riggs followed, then Kelly and Cross, then Mallory hauling the radio. Hayes brought up the rear, his rifle trained on the ridge, covering their movement. Claire remained prone, covering fire. If any of the surviving hostiles tried to regroup, she'd drop them before they could draw a bead on her squad. But no one tried. Through the scope, she watched them flee. 4 soldiers, disoriented and leaderless, stumbling down the far side of the ridge, abandoning their weapons, their position, everything. They'd thought this was a casino. Now they knew it was a graveyard. Claire let out a slow breath. Her hands were steady. Her heart rate was already climbing back up as adrenaline flooded in, but the shots were done. The sequence was complete. 5 targets, 23 seconds, 5 hits. She cycled the bolt one last time, chambering a fresh round, then pushed herself up from the snow. Her legs were stiff from the cold, her shoulder aching from the recoil, but she moved automatically, slinging the rifle and jogging after her squad. Ahead, they were crossing the meadow. No longer a killing field, just an expanse of snow and brush. No machine gun fire tore through them. No mortar rounds dropped from the sky. Just silence, and 30 seconds that had rewritten the rules of the fight. The first shot had broken more than one life. It had broken the sound barrier at 2,800 feet per second, broken through layered clothing and tactical vest, broken bone and tissue, and the arrogant certainty that the high ground meant invincibility. But more than that, it had broken the laughter. One moment, the enemy squad leader had been standing tall, mouth open, mid-jeer, his voice carrying across the valley like a ringmaster announcing the main act. The next moment, he was falling. Not dramatically, not with cinematic slowness, but with the sudden, graceless collapse of a puppet with cut strings. The laughter stopped. For half a heartbeat, the ridge went silent. The remaining hostiles stood frozen, their brains struggling to process what their eyes had just witnessed. Their leader, invincible seconds ago, was now a crumpled shape in the snow. Then chaos. "Contact! Contact!" Where'd it come from? "Medic, we need a—" The second shot cut through the shouting. The mortar gunner, halfway through turning toward his fallen leader, jerked backward and went still. The soldier beside him, the one who'd been feeding rounds, stared in horror, then dove behind the tube, hands over his head. That's when the fear set in. 3 seconds ago, they'd been predators. Now they were prey, and they didn't even know where the hunter was. The machine gunner grabbed his weapon, swinging it wildly toward the meadow, finger already on the trigger. He fired a long, desperate burst, tracers arcing into empty snow, nowhere near first squad's position. The muzzle flash lit up his face, and in that instant of exposure, the third round found him. The MG fell silent. On the right flank, the enemy marksman, trained, professional, the kind of soldier who didn't panic, had gone prone and was scanning methodically for the source of the fire. He was good enough to know what he was looking for. Muzzle flash, disrupted snow, the faint heat shimmer of a rifle's suppressor. He found it. His rifle swung toward Claire's position, crosshair zeroing in on the gap in the stone wall where she'd set up. His finger tightened on the trigger. The fourth round hit him before he could fire. And then there were 4. The second in command, a wiry, sharp-eyed corporal who'd been standing near the sandbags, was shouting orders, trying desperately to impose order on the unraveling chaos. "Suppressing fire on the tree line, now! Cover the—" The fifth shot silenced him mid-sentence. And then there were 3. No, not 3. Because the soldier who'd been hiding behind the mortar tube broke first. He scrambled to his feet and ran, not toward cover, not toward his weapon, but away, sprinting down the backside of the ridge like the devil himself was on his heels. The other 2 followed within seconds. One of them tried to grab his rifle on the way out and tripped over a sandbag, sprawling face first into the snow before abandoning the weapon entirely and fleeing empty-handed. 23 seconds. 5 shots. An entire defensive position dismantled. Hayes had seen a lot of things in his 6 years of service. He'd seen artillery turn a hillside into a moonscape. He'd seen helicopter gunships obliterate convoys. He'd seen drone strikes erase grid squares from existence. But he'd never seen one person, with 5 bullets, collapse a fortified enemy position so completely that the survivors fled without returning fire. He stood at the edge of the meadow, his squad already halfway across, and looked back at Claire. She was jogging toward him, rifle slung, her face expressionless. No triumph. No relief, just the same calm, unreadable mask she always wore. "Jesus Christ," Riggs muttered beside him, staring up at the now silent ridge. She actually did it. Hayes didn't respond. He was too busy processing what he'd just witnessed. The wind picked up again, carrying the faint smell of gunpowder and the metallic tang of blood. Snow began to fall, slow and deliberate, already starting to cover the evidence of what had just happened. On the ridge, the abandoned machine gun sat like a monument to misplaced confidence. And somewhere in the forest beyond, 3 enemy soldiers were still running, their laughter replaced by the frantic rhythm of boots on frozen ground and the knowledge that they'd just bet against the wrong person. The second shot had been the hardest. Not because of distance or wind or the technical difficulty of the shot itself. Those variables were constants, manageable, things Claire's training had prepared her for. The second shot was hard because of what it meant. The first shot could have been luck, a fluke, random chance in a universe that sometimes smiled on the desperate. The enemy could have written it off as a stray round from a lucky amateur, a 1 in a million accident. But the second shot erased that possibility. The second shot said, this is deliberate, this is skill, this is someone who knows exactly what they're doing. The mortar gunner had died with that realization dawning on his face. Claire had seen it through the scope, the moment his expression shifted from confusion to comprehension to horror. He'd understood in the last second of his life that he wasn't being harassed by scattered rifle fire or suppressed by area weapons. He was being hunted, methodically, precisely, by someone who was better than him. The third shot, the machine gunner, had been about eliminating firepower. The MG was the biggest threat to First Squad's movement across the meadow. Take it out, and the path opened. Simple tactical math. But there was nothing simple about the execution. The gunner had been partially concealed behind sandbags, only his upper torso and head exposed. He'd been moving, swinging the weapon left and right, finger on the trigger. A moving target in partial cover at 600 meters was the kind of shot that qualified as difficult, even under ideal conditions. Claire had taken it in 0.4 of a second. She'd waited for the exact moment he paused, that fractional instant when he stopped traversing the gun to adjust his grip on the belt feed. In that sliver of stillness, her crosshair found him, and her trigger finger moved with the inevitability of a clock's second hand. The MG's muzzle flash died mid-burst. The tracers stopped arcing across the meadow. The weapon sagged forward, its operator slumped over the receiver, and the enemy position lost its teeth. The fourth shot, the marksman, had been personal. Not in an emotional sense. Claire didn't hate him, didn't even know him, but there was a recognition there, a professional acknowledgement between two people who shared the same skill set, the same training, the same understanding of what it meant to be the one who took the hard shots while everyone else sprayed and prayed. He'd been good enough to identify her position despite the suppressor, despite the angle, despite the chaos erupting around him. Good enough to go prone, control his breathing, acquire his target. Good enough to almost matter. Almost. Claire's shot had been 1/10 of a second faster. That was the difference between breathing and bleeding. 1/10 of a second, the gap between survival and irrelevance. She wondered briefly if he'd felt the same cold professionalism she did, if, in the instant before the round found him, he'd respected the skill that had beaten him. Probably not. He'd probably just felt surprised. The fifth shot, the second in command, had been mercy. Not for him, for his men. He'd been trying to rally them, impose order, turn the rout into a fighting retreat. If he'd succeeded, the remaining soldiers might have regrouped, established a new firing line, made the meadow crossing costly even without the MG. Claire's shot removed that possibility. Leadership gone, cohesion gone, morale shattered. The survivors had no reason to stay and every reason to run. So they ran. And in running, they carried a story with them. A story about a squad that had held the high ground, that had mocked their enemies, that had treated war like a game with guaranteed odds. A story about how that certainty had shattered in 23 seconds, about how 5 of their brothers had fallen to 5 shots, about how the person who'd done it hadn't fired wildly or desperately or with any trace of fear. Just cold, clinical perfect. Bet us, they'd said. Claire had. And she'd won. Not because she was stronger or braver or more deserving, not because of luck or divine intervention or plot armor, but because she'd spent years learning to read wind, to control her breathing, to translate distance and angles into muscle memory, because she'd failed that state championship shot at 17 and spent the next 6 years making sure she'd never fail again. Because when the world told her she was too small, too quiet, too new to matter, she'd stopped listening to the world and started listening to the rifle. And the rifle never lied. Hayes watched her cross the meadow, and for the first time since she'd joined First Squad, he didn't see a boot. He didn't see someone who needed to prove herself. He saw a sergeant who'd just saved 7 lives with 5 bullets. Riggs saw it too. So did Kelly, Cross, Jennings, Mallory. The whole squad saw it. And none of them would ever see her the same way again. The squad reached the tree line on the far side of the meadow in under 90 seconds. No one fired at them. No mortar rounds fell. No machine gun tracers ripped through the air. The crossing that should have been a slaughter became nothing more than a hard sprint through knee-deep snow, lungs burning, hearts hammering, boots slipping on frozen ground. When they hit the cover of the pines, Jennings dropped to one knee, her SAW trained back toward the ridge. Riggs took up position beside her, rifle shouldered. Kelly and Cross spread out, establishing a perimeter. Mallory collapsed against a tree trunk, gasping for air, the radio still strapped to his back. Hayes did a quick head count. 7. Everyone accounted for. No injuries. They'd made it. He turned to look back at the ridge, half expecting to see movement, regrouping hostiles, some last-ditch effort to salvage the ambush. There was nothing. The enemy position sat abandoned, sandbags still in place, weapons scattered, bodies motionless in the snow. The wind had already started to cover everything with a thin white shroud, erasing the evidence of what had happened. It looked like a ghost town, like the soldiers who'd occupied it had simply vanished. LT, Jennings said quietly, we clear? Hayes scanned the ridge one more time, then nodded. We're clear. Riggs let out a breath he'd been holding for the past 2 minutes. Holy hell! Watch your language, Corporal, Hayes said automatically, but his tone was distracted. He was still processing, still trying to reconcile what he'd just witnessed with what he'd thought was possible. Claire emerged from the meadow last, moving at a steady jog, her rifle slung, her face unreadable. She reached the tree line and took up a position next to Kelly without a word. The squad stared at her, not with the skepticism from before, not with the polite distance they'd kept for the past 6 weeks, with something else. Sergeant Emerson, Hayes said. She looked at him. Sir, that was... He paused, searching for words that didn't sound like hyperbole. That was exemplary shooting. Thank you, sir. No pride in her voice, no false modesty, just acknowledgement. Riggs shook his head slowly. 5 shots, 5 kills, at 600 meters, in under 30 seconds. He looked at Claire like she'd just walked on water. I've been in this job for 8 years, and I've never seen anything like that. I have, Jennings said, on a firing range, with static targets, perfect conditions. And even then, the shooter took twice as long. Cross, still catching his breath, managed, How did you... the wind alone. Claire shrugged slightly. Training. Training? Kelly's voice cracked. That wasn't training. That was... Training, Claire repeated, firmer this time. Her eyes swept across the squad. That's all it was. Reading wind, accounting for drop, trigger control, everything they teach at Benning. I just did what I was taught. Bullshit, Riggs said, then immediately caught himself. Sorry, LT, but respectfully, Sergeant Emerson, that was more than training. That was discipline, Hayes cut in. His voice was quiet but carried weight. That was discipline under pressure, following procedure when everything's falling apart. That's what separates professionals from amateurs. Claire met his eyes. Something passed between them. Understanding, respect, the acknowledgement that they both knew what it cost to stay calm when the world was on fire. Yes, sir, she said simply. Mallory finally found his voice. I doubted you. Back there, when the LT said you'd make the shot, I thought. He trailed off, shaking his head. I'm sorry. Don't be, Claire said. Doubt's healthy, keeps you sharp. Not anymore, Jennings said. Not with you. The words hung in this cold air. Around them, the forest was silent except for the whisper of wind through pine needles and the faint creak of snow-laden branches. On the ridge behind them, the abandoned enemy position stood as a monument to misplaced certainty, to the arrogance of assuming the high ground guaranteed victory, to the fatal mistake of underestimating the quiet one. Bet us, they'd said. The bet was over, and the house had lost. The adrenaline hit Claire 15 minutes later. They'd moved deeper into the forest, putting distance between themselves and the ridge, following a game trail that wound northwest toward the rally point where 2nd Platoon should have been waiting. Hayes set a fast pace, not quite a run, but close. Get distance, establish security, regroup. Claire kept up, moving on autopilot, her body running on fumes and muscle memory. Then her hands started shaking, not visibly, not enough that anyone else would notice, but she felt it, the fine tremor in her fingers, the way her grip on the rifle stock wasn't quite as solid as it had been 5 minutes ago. Her breathing hitched, just slightly, and her heart rate spiked. The price was coming due. She'd held it together through the setup, the shots, the crossing. She'd stayed calm, focused, professional. But the human body could only sustain that level of control for so long before it demanded payment. Adrenaline was a loan, not a gift, and the interest was brutal. Her shoulder ached where the rifle had kicked back 5 times in rapid succession. The cold had seeped into her bones during the prone shooting position, and now her joints felt stiff, creaky. Her hands, exposed to the freezing air while she'd adjusted the scope and cycled the bolt, were borderline numb. But worse than the physical toll was the mental one. 5 people were dead because she'd pulled a trigger. She knew that, had known it the moment she'd made the decision to fire. This wasn't her first combat deployment, wasn't the first time she'd taken a life. But knowing and feeling were different things, and right now, the feeling was catching up. 5 people, 5 families that would get notifications, 5 gaps in someone's unit roster. 5 lives ended in 23 seconds by a woman most of her own squad hadn't trusted an hour ago. Emerson. She blinked. Hayes had fallen back beside her, his expression concerned. You good? Yes, sir. Her voice was steady. That, at least, she could control. Hayes didn't look convinced. Your hands are shaking. Adrenaline dump. It'll pass. I know it will. He paused, lowering his voice so the rest of the squad wouldn't hear. But if you need a minute... I don't. Claire met his eyes. We need to keep moving. Second platoon's 5 clicks out. Enemy might regroup. Staying here's a risk. Hayes studied her for a moment, then nodded. All right, but when we link up, you're taking a break. That's an order. Yes, sir. He moved back to the front of the formation, leaving Claire alone with her thoughts. Riggs dropped back next to her. For a few steps, he didn't say anything. Then, I owe you an apology. Claire glanced at him. For what? For doubting you. Back there, when the LT said you'd take the shot, I thought... He grimaced. I thought we were screwed. Thought he was putting too much faith in someone who hadn't proven themselves yet. You weren't wrong to think that, Claire said. I hadn't proven myself. You have now. She didn't respond. I mean it, Riggs continued. What you did back there, that wasn't luck. That was skill. The kind of skill that saves lives. He paused. You saved mine. So, thank you. Claire's throat tightened. She swallowed, nodded. Just doing my job, Corporal. Your job's a hell of a lot harder than mine. He picked up his pace, rejoining the formation, leaving Claire alone again. Ahead, Kelly glanced back, caught her eye, gave her a small nod. Respect. Acknowledgement. Jennings did the same a minute later. Then Cross. Then Mallory. One by one, the squad that had doubted her, that had questioned whether she could handle the pressure, was telling her without words that they'd been wrong. It should have felt good, validating, the thing she'd been working toward for 6 weeks. Instead, it just felt heavy. Because respect earned through taking lives wasn't the kind of respect she'd wanted. She'd wanted to prove herself through competence, through reliability, through being the person they could count on when things got hard. She'd gotten that. But the cost was 5 bodies on a ridge, and the knowledge that she'd never be able to unhear the sound of her own rifle, never be able to unsee the way the enemy marksman had looked at her through his scope in the instant before she'd fired. Her hands were still shaking. Hayes was right. It would pass. But right now, in this moment, walking through a frozen forest with a squad that finally saw her as an equal, Claire Emerson felt the weight of perfection settle onto her shoulders like a second rucksack. And she carried it because that's what professionals did. They carried the weight. They linked up with 2nd Platoon 2 hours later, just as the sun dropped below the western ridge and turned the sky the color of old bruises. Captain Sarah Brennan took Hayes' report in clipped professional tones, her eyes narrowing when he described the contact, the encirclement, the 5 precision shots that had broken the enemy position. When he finished, she looked past him to where Claire sat on a fallen log, methodically cleaning her rifle. Sergeant Emerson, Brennan called. Claire stood, rifle slung, and approached. Ma'am? Lieutenant Hayes tells me you dropped 5 hostiles in under 30 seconds, 600 meters, crosswind, high-value targets. Yes, ma'am. Brennan studied her. That's exceptional work. Thank you, ma'am. I'll be putting you in for a commendation. Claire's expression didn't change. That's not necessary, ma'am. It's not about necessity, Sergeant. It's about recognition. Brennan's tone softened slightly. You saved your squad. That matters. Claire nodded once. Permission to return to my unit, ma'am? Brennan gestured toward where 1st Squad had set up a perimeter. Dismissed. Claire walked back to the log, sat down, resumed cleaning her rifle. The familiar ritual, pull the bolt, run the cleaning rod, check the chamber, oil the action, grounded her, made the world smaller, simpler. Riggs sat down beside her, not saying anything, just sharing the space. A few minutes later, Jennings joined them, then Kelly. They didn't talk about the ridge, didn't rehash the shots or the crossing or the moment when everything had hung in the balance. They just existed together, a squad, not perfect, not invincible, but alive. Hayes approached, carrying 2 MRE pouches. He tossed one to Claire. Eat, you've burned about 3,000 calories today. She caught it one-handed. Thank you, sir. He sat down across from her, tearing open his own meal. You did good back there. We all did. Yeah. He took a bite, chewed thoughtfully. But you made it possible. Claire looked up in the sky. Snow was falling again, slow and deliberate, each flake catching the last traces of daylight before vanishing into the gathering dark. Somewhere behind them, maybe 5 kilometers back, the ridge still stood. The bodies were still there. The abandoned weapons, the sandbags. Tomorrow, someone would find them, document them, add them to the casualty reports that would filter up through command chains and eventually reach families who would never know the full story of how their sons, brothers, fathers had died. They would know it was combat. They would know it was quick. They wouldn't know about the laughter, the taunts, the arrogance that had turned a defensive position into a graveyard. They wouldn't know about bet us, and that was probably for the best. Claire opened her MRE, started eating mechanically. The food had no taste. Everything felt muted, distant, like she was watching herself from outside her own body. It gets easier, Hayes said quietly. She looked at him. The weight, he clarified. The aftermath. First few times it feels like you're carrying a mountain. But it gets easier, not because you stop caring, because you learn how to carry it. Does it? Claire asked. Hayes was quiet for a moment. No, he admitted. Not really, but you get stronger. She nodded slowly, took another bite. Around them, the platoon settled in for the night. Sentries posted, perimeter established, fires forbidden because of the risk of enemy contact. Just cold, dark, and the whisper of falling snow. Riggs leaned back against the log. Hey, Emerson? Yeah? Next time someone tells me women can't handle combat roles, I'm just going to tell them about today. Claire almost smiled. Almost. Don't. Why not? Because what I did today wasn't about being a woman. It was about being a soldier. She met his eyes. Start making it about gender and you miss the point. Riggs considered that, then nodded. Fair enough. Jennings stretched her legs out. So what was the point? Claire looked at her rifle resting across her lap. Clean now, ready, waiting for the next time she'd need it. The point, she said slowly, is that when people underestimate you, you don't argue. You don't explain. You just do the work, let the results speak. And if they still don't believe you? Claire's eyes drifted back to the ridge, invisible now in the darkness, but still there, still real. Then you do it again, she said, and again, until they have no choice but to see you. Kelly grinned. Pretty sure they see you now. Yeah, Cross added. Pretty sure the whole damn enemy force sees you. The squad chuckled, the tension finally breaking. But Claire didn't laugh. She just sat there holding her rifle, feeling the weight of what she'd done and what it meant. 5 shots, 5 lives, 5 moments when she'd been given the choice between hesitation and action, and she'd chosen action. She'd do it again if she had to, would make the same choices, pull the same trigger, accept the same cost. Because that's what it meant to be the person others depended on. And as the snow fell around her, covering the forest in a blanket of white, Claire Emerson understood that the bet hadn't been about proving herself to the enemy. It had been about proving herself to herself. And she'd won. The snow still fell. The ridge still stood. And somewhere in the frozen darkness, 3 enemy soldiers were still running, carrying a story they'd never forget about the day they bet against silence and lost everything.